Hey, what is up, Mistwood Publishing Patreons? This is SR Mori here with your bi-weekly behind-the-scenes video. And by request, I will be doing a video on the social structure of elves in the Legends of Fostra. I might do more on that, but most of the other races don't have as complicated or as detailed or as offensive of a structure as elves. So I figured elves is a good place to start. This is the temporary Mistwood office. We should have the final office done by sometime in the spring. It's going to be a long process getting it done, both because of money and just labor. And that was your second video for September. If you wanted to see that video again of me walking around the future Mistwood office. I think by Christmas we'll probably have the carpet ripped up and we'll have the paint up, and we might remove the paint on that fireplace. So either the fireplace will have the natural brick or a different color than it was, and it'll be great. And we'll get the floors down in the spring. That's the big pricey thing. And then once that's done and we have the barn door in, it's really done. You just gotta move everything in there and we'll be good to go. In other Mistwood Publishing news, I, thanks to Kentucky legislation, no longer have to rush getting a master's, which means, it's good news for you guys, that means I can now get a master's whenever I want to, which, instead of doing it next year, that allows me to get Sagas 1, 2, and 3, and 4, re-edit 5, The Sylvan Mist, and get 6 out before I take a little break. And that'll be probably where I get my master's in, and where I kind of I'm going to take a little bit of time to really outline the plot of the last 3 books, the conclusion of the whole series, just so that it's all done nice and neatly. And those last 3 books are kind of like my Lord of the Rings, so I want to make sure it's done 100% correctly. So anyway, that means you'll be getting more books sooner, and you'll still be getting all those novellas I have planned and all of those things, and it'll be great. It'll be awesome. But anyway, to the topic of the day, you have elves, right? Which the first elves that were created by Gesu were the High Elves and the Water Elves. Basically, I mean, it's pretty simple. I mean, they lived down in Verdurn for quite a long time before the events of Ragnarok, which is where, you have the fall, and before that you have, before Ragnarok you have Vandir going and tempting everybody and getting them to do dark magic and abandoning Gesu. And it's during that several thousand-year period before Ragnarok that you see the development of Wood Elves, which are basically just High Elves that have, through generation after generation, instead of kind of living in the more lavish cities that High Elves tend to favor, these were elves that branched off and preferred to live in the forests. And so over time their bodies grew shorter and more accustomed to navigating forests, and they tend to have more auburn or red hair, whereas High Elves always have gold hair. Always. So Wood Elves kind of come about naturally through just microevolution, or whatever you want to say it is. So you have Water Elves that are under the water, and they kind of have their cities are like in the Disney movie Atlantis, where you go underwater and then there's an air bubble. So Water Elves can breathe underwater, but they're kind of isolated. But because High Elves and Water Elves were made at the same time by Gesu himself, they are considered the highest. Now a High Elf would say that a Water Elf would be beneath them, but they are on equal footing. It's just that the water elves don't necessarily, they're not very social, they don't come out a lot, and so they're very disconnected. Some water elves live in the oceans, most of them live in lakes, but there are water elves in the oceans, and there are a lot of monsters in the oceans that I have not even touched. It's kind of like this mysterious world that I plan on exploring in a novella someday or something, but it's going to be crazy. And if you really read the origins of the universe in Saga 1 when it comes out, you'll notice one of Rollo's sons does not actually die in Ragnarok. And if you read the one that's Silver Mist, you'll notice one of the sons doesn't actually die. But he actually leaves and, struck by grief, becomes basically the god of the ocean. And so you'll see him come up in things. He's kind of like my Poseidon, so to speak, because Poseidon's like my favorite. So water elves and high elves are pretty much equal. And even though high elves are really the only ones there to enforce the hierarchy. So high elves tend to wear gold and red to kind of show their station, and they generally come from the capital city of Grendel in Fostra. In Verdurn, it's the Evergreen Island in the higher branches of the capital tree. And water elves tend to wear gold or silver and usually blue in the mix, though it depends on what water elf. The water elves are, again, less strict on the social structure, so they're going to wear kind of what they want depending on their clan. But it tends to involve silver, gold, and blue. Then wood elves, who are kind of like under the thumb of high elves, they tend to wear brown and green. And they tend to live in the other cities on the eastern, like Berlin and Magturig and those other elven cities on the eastern half of the Immortal Forest. That's kind of like the more advanced, better side of the forest, like the trees are older and thicker because the western half was very largely destroyed in the Dwavarian Wars, where the elves and the dwarves had a big scuffle. And the elves would tell you the dwarves burnt down that forest, but the dwarves would tell you the elves burnt down that forest. But anyway, the trees on the western half of the Immortal Forest are not as old, and thus the wood elves and the high elves kind of deem themselves, they prefer the east. Not that they wouldn't exist on the west, but very rarely are you going to see them on the west of the river in the Immortal Forest. So next you have high elf or half elves, which is Elion, and this is just a species of elves that comes around just naturally. High elves don't have the highest opinion of humans, and so whenever an elf has mixed with a high elf or a wood elf, their station is deemed less than because it's kind of a forbidden love type scenario, kind of like Aragorn and Arwen. So, Aragorn comes from a descendant of half-elves. So anyway, so they're kind of deemed on the bottom. So you have like high elves and water elves, wood elves, half-elves. And they're kind of solely located on the western side of the Immortal Forest because, again, those trees are younger and the half-elves aren't worthy of it, right? And they generally wear black and maybe green. If you really read the Silver Mist, you'll notice, and the ebook that's coming here in November, Taran will mention, or Elion will mention that he doesn't like wearing those clothes because the high elves kind of make them do that so that you know exactly what that person is. And it's kind of like Nazi Germany making the Jews wear the stars. You have to wear specific colors. But Elion, he doesn't like wearing those colors, doesn't like being identified like that. And half elves can have red hair, blonde hair, brown hair, black hair. They're a mix between human and elf, really. And there are different levels of half elf, like if your dad was an elf and your mom was a human and you're a first generation half elf, or if your dad was a half elf and your mom was a half elf, or if your dad was a half elf and your mom was a full elf, or so all these different mixes of that, and depending on how much human you have in you determines how low you are. And I'd love to tell you Elion's true parentage. I mean, the parents he thinks are his parents, but maybe the percentage of elf and human isn't exactly what he thinks it is. Maybe there's a certain amount of bloodline coursing in his veins that's important and relevant, but I can't tell you what those are yet. And then you have gray elves. And gray elves, kind of like how water elves are separate, but also not. Gray elves are that same thing, and gray elves were made by basically it's all in Saga 1, it covers all this, but basically at some point, I don't know it off the top of my head, in Elven history, there was a really gorgeous elf who fell in love with this other elf who practiced dark magic, and the parents didn't approve, and so, sticking it to her parents, she left with this guy, and they ended up making a very powerful empire, and it was very heavily relied on dark magic and necromancy and not good things. She was very proud of her beauty, and anyway, long story short, she kills her husband, and then her subjects rise up, and anyway, Gesu intervenes and punishes her by taking away her beauty, and a few other things I don't want to spoil yet. But basically her followers, that were elves, were made into gray elves. And they tend to wear all black. Maybe some red, but pretty much all black. And the reason why you have some red is because Neris and her husband Karam were high elves. So they bring that, instead of like gold and red, it's black and red, right? And they tend to worship Mirakuba, or Neris herself, or any god that is not necessarily the best judge of character, Grey elves are generally very evil. I got them very inspired from the Drow in Forgotten Realms and Drizzt Do'Urden and stuff. And you will have a female version of Drizzt, sort of. She's a gray elf who's not evil. And that's the similarities that they have, and that's it. But that'll be in Saga 6. It'll be great. But, so you have high elves and water elves, although water elves are kind of detached and keep to themselves. And then you have wood elves, half elves, gray elves. And some high elves would say gray elves and half elves are the same, but in reality the gray elves are just evil. They're evil, and they slaughtered and absolutely destroyed the whole half-elven city of Neldorath, and that's when Narbad comes and saves Elion, but they're pretty terrible if you can't tell from Vindel. So that's kind of the social structure of elves. Humans, I could probably go in and explain the different countries and their situation in another video, but I think this video is probably already long enough. So, dwarves is pretty simple. And they don't really have a social structure, but I could go over the different cities and cultures. And gnomes are really simple. Let me know if you want to hear any of these, or maybe you want to hear more explanation on certain human kingdoms, or if this wasn't a very good explanation, let me know, and I will try to do something better. Hopefully this clarified things enough and was a good explanation. Peace out.